How to analyze a balance sheet like a hedge fund analyst.
Investment firm to help you guys better understand what to look for when investing. Whether you are a new investor just buying your first stock or if you've been investing for years, I guarantee if you stick around till the end of this video, you will learn something new and useful that you can begin applying to your own investment research process today. Now let's get into the video. Understanding the inner workings of a company's balance sheet is absolutely critical when investing. A good balance sheet can be the difference between losing all of your money when investing or having a successful investment. If a company has too much debt or runs out of cash and can't fund its operations, that means the company could be heading for bankruptcy. If that happens, there's a solid chance that your investment in the company. An asset is any item or resource with a monetary value that a business owns. Cash that the company has in its bank account or accounting in this video, but just keep this equation in mind as we go throughout the rest of this video, such as property and machinery. For liabilities, current liabilities are liabilities that are expected to be paid off within 1 year, while non-current liabilities are liabilities the company expects to have for longer than 1 year. It's also interesting to note that assets appear in the order of their liquidity. Liquidity is just a fancy word for how quickly assets can be turned into cash. Cash is the most liquid asset because, well, it's already cash. The most liquid assets are at the top, and the least liquid assets, like property, plant, and equipment, for example, are at the bottom of the asset section. So now that we have that background and why the balance sheet is so important, let's go line by line of a company's balance sheet and talk about what you need to know. In this example, we are going to be using Apple. But first, a quick word from our sponsor, Masterworks. If you follow my channel, you probably know how turbulent the market has been. With inflation hitting a 30-year high, many professional investors are either trying to find ways to significantly outperform the market over the long term. This line is pretty self-explanatory. Cash is just the money that you have sitting in a checking or savings account. The part that needs some explaining is cash equivalents. Cash equivalents are short-term and super
Things that can be turned into cash in very quick order.
safe investments that can easily be turned into cash. The reason companies put their money into these short-term but extremely low-risk investments is to earn a little extra money. Think about it. If you're Apple and you have tens of billions of dollars of cash, if you're able to get even a very small return on your money, that is millions of dollars of extra cash you are generating. Moving down the balance sheet, we have marketable securities. This is where the analysis really starts to take place. These marketable securities are already low risk and can be turned into cash relatively easily. Marketable securities consist of things like government bonds. When I'm trying to calculate a company's true cash, I always like to add the marketable securities into the cash and cash equivalents line. So we can see at the end of 2021, Apple had $34,940 in cash and cash equivalents, $27,699 in marketable securities, and $127,877 in non-current marketable securities. If we add these three numbers together, we get $190,516. The reason I add these numbers together is because I want to determine
And that's in millions.
how much true cash the company has relative to its debt, as well as how much cash the company can use to do things such as buy other companies, pay dividends, or repurchase stock. Next up, we have accounts receivable. Accounts receivable is the amount of money owed to the company by customers for purchases made on credit. Let's say you own a lemonade stand. One of your customers asks you to supply lemonade to a party he's hosting. Let's say you supply $20 worth of lemonade to the party and the customer says to send him over the bill for $20 and he will pay you next week. This is an example of an accounts receivable.
Sometimes, the company that owes somebody money goes bankrupt and they don't get paid. But ideally, hopefully they will pay you.
From the time you provided the lemonade to the customer but have yet to receive payment, you have a $20 account receivable from the customer. So in the case of Apple, if they are selling their iPhones to a large corporate customer but are awaiting payment, this would show up on the balance sheet as an accounts receivable. The next line I want to cover is inventories. These are products that are completed and ready to be sold but have yet to be sold to a customer. So in the case of Apple, it would be the iPhones, iPads, and MacBooks that have been manufactured but have not yet been sold to customers. As an investor, you want to make sure that these inventory levels aren't growing significantly, as it can be a sign that the company is having a difficult time selling its products. For example, one of Apple's rivals, Microsoft, had this problem a while back. Back in 2013, Microsoft took a loss of nearly $1 billion on one of its products, because the company simply overestimated demand. They made way too much of the product because the company thought demand from customers was going to be higher than to the line titled Property, Plant, and Equipment. Property, plant, and equipment, or PP&E for short, are physical assets that a company owns that typically have a life of longer than 1 year. This can include things like vehicles, furniture, computers, machinery, buildings, or land. For Apple, an example of this would be its $5 billion headquarters that it built called Apple Park. The larger this PP&E number is, the more capital-intensive an industry is. Examples of capital-intensive industries include railroads, oil companies, and auto manufacturers.
All right, I'm gonna be straightforward with you. I paid for this.
An industry is to divide PP&E by the company's annual revenue. This shows you how much property, plant, and equipment it took a company to generate a certain amount of revenue. For example, if we do this analysis with Apple, we see that property, plant, and equipment is 11% of annual revenue. This is a relatively capital-light industry, the opposite of a capital-intensive industry. However, let's try this with a railroad. Let's use Union Pacific, which is a railroad covering the western part of the United States. If we do the same calculation, we get a value of 277%. This shows just how much more capital-intensive Union Pacific is compared to Apple. Now, I want to jump to the liability section of the balance sheet. The first line I want to touch on is accounts payable. Think of this line as the opposite of accounts receivable. Accounts payable is money that Apple owes to its suppliers for products and services Apple has received but has not yet paid for. So, for example, let's say the company that makes glass for the front of the iPhone sent Apple $100 million of glass during the month. Apple has received the glass from its supplier, but until Apple pays the supplier for that material, the amount Apple owes, in this case $100 million, shows up in the line titled Accounts Payable. The next line item I want to touch on is deferred revenue. This is an important line item for software companies and many tech companies. The easiest way to explain this is with Netflix. So when you sign up for Netflix, the company bills you upfront, let's say $15. You pay $15 at the beginning of the month, and that allows you to access Netflix for the entire month. However, because of accounting rules, the company cannot classify that $15 you pay them as revenue until they provide the service to you. So in this example, provide you with a month of access to Netflix. So that $15 will show up in deferred revenue until after the company has provided you with the promised service. This is very common in subscription-based software businesses like Netflix, Microsoft, Adobe, and Salesforce. In the case of Apple, this deferred revenue would come from their services business like Apple Music and iCloud storage. Next up is commercial paper. This is simply very short-term debt, around only 30 days until the company has to pay it off. Companies use commercial paper to fund the daily operations of their business, such as payroll, paying suppliers, and things like that. The biggest difference between commercial paper and the next line, term debt, is that commercial paper is just super short-term loans. This brings me to the most important part of analyzing a company's balance sheet, understanding the company's debt. In the case of Apple, their debt is listed as 3 separate lines: commercial paper, the current portion of term debt, and the non-current portion of term debt. Just a reminder that current means the debt is due within 12 months, while non-current means due at a time longer than 12 months. In order to calculate what I refer to as Apple's true debt, we have to add these 3 lines together. Adding together the $6,000 of commercial paper, the $9,613 current portion of debt, and the $109,106 non-current portion of debt, we see that Apple's true debt is $124,719. However, I want to take this analysis one step further. So now that we have Apple's true cash that we calculated earlier and the company's true debt, we now want to calculate what in the investing industry is referred to as net debt. It's a super easy calculation. Just take the company's debt and subtract out the cash the company has. This leaves you with a net amount of debt. If we do this with Apple, we get negative $65,797. This means that the company in theory does not have any debt on its balance sheet because its cash exceeds its debt. It's important to subtract out the cash a company has from its debt amount in order to see how much net debt the company has that it can't pay right away. In the case of Apple, even though the company technically has $124 billion of debt, they really don't because they have far more cash on the balance sheet than debt. At first glance, you as an investor might be worried about that large debt amount of $124 billion, but once you understand that Apple has cash of $190 billion, you suddenly aren't so worried about that debt number at all anymore. In order to illustrate my point, let's use another company as an example, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has $42,793 in debt and $10,914 in cash. In order to calculate Coca-Cola's net debt, we take the debt amount and subtract out the cash amount. This leaves us with a net debt amount of $31,879. So this leaves an important question for us as an investor. Is this a large net debt figure or not? That completely depends on how much money the company makes. If a company makes $10 billion a year in profits, $1 billion in debts would be a relatively small amount of debt. However, if a company only makes $100 million in profits a year, that same $1 billion in debt would probably crush it and cause it to go bankrupt.
Listen, there's never been a more important time in recent
Determine whether a company can support its debt through the cash it generates is to calculate its net debt to EBITDA ratio. This is a pretty straightforward calculation. You take the company's net debt and divide it by its annual EBITDA, which is what we usually use as a proxy for cash flow. If you want to learn more about EBITDA and how to analyze an income statement, check out the video I did on it here. Coca-Cola had an EBITDA of $10,533 in 2020. By taking Coca-Cola's net debt and dividing it by this EBITDA amount, we get a net debt to EBITDA ratio of 3.03. The best way to analyze this number is to compare it to that of the company's competitors in the same industry. This is because different industries use varying amounts of debt to fund the operations of the company. It wouldn't make sense to compare Coca-Cola's net debt to EBITDA to a high-growth software company, but it would make sense to compare it to other consumer packaged good companies like Nestle or Procter & Gamble. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about the shareholder equity section because pretty much all of your time as an investor should be spent better understanding the assets and the liabilities of a company. However, there is one investment metric that I do want to bring your attention to. That metric is return on equity, and it is calculated by taking a company's net income from the income statement and dividing it by the company's total shareholders' equity. Return on equity tells you how much net income a company generates per dollar of invested capital. This percentage is key because it helps investors understand how efficiently a firm uses its capital to generate profit. So for Apple, we take the company's net income for 2021 of $94,640 and divide it by the total shareholders' equity of $63,090. This leaves us with a return on equity of 150%. Generally speaking, the higher this number is, the better. The most useful thing to do for this number is to compare it to that of the company's competitors in the same industry. Samsung is one of Apple's competitors. Want to take a guess on what their return on equity is?
So that is the balance sheet. This one is the income statement. And then the next one is cash flow.
Period of time, with the other two key statements being the balance sheet and the statement of cash flows. The income statement breaks down a company's revenue, the money they made from selling their products and services, their expenses, such as the cost to make the product.
And to me, the balance sheet is more important because the income statement can be manipulated. Like in the last company that we looked at, Toro or whatever, they just sold one of their vessels for $23 million. So yeah, their income's going to go up because they just sold one of their ships. And there's a lot of shady tricks people can do. That's why I would trust the balance sheet a little more than the income statement.
Hire employees, rent buildings, etc., and ultimately the company's profit, which can be simplified as a company sales. In this example, we are going to search Annual Report Apple. This will bring us to Apple's Investor Relations website. On that website, we just click on the link to their most recent annual report.
Or you can just go to sec.gov, go to filing search, type in the symbol.
This will bring up Apple's annual report, otherwise referred to as their 10K. Within the annual report is Apple's income statement. Now let's start breaking down and analyzing the income statement. Real quick, just a couple of things to note as you're looking at a company's income statement. First, note how in the case of Apple, these numbers are in millions of dollars, and this is just to make the income statement more condensed and easier to read. So, total sales in 2021 was $300.
So this is really billions, $300 billion.
$165 billion, not $365,000. And then another important thing to note is that some companies don't have the years on their income statement match up with the calendar year. So for example, Apple's 2021 year ended in September 2021, not December 2021. I have been analyzing companies for years and got a degree in accounting from college, and I still don't understand why some companies do this. It's not super important, but just something to keep in mind. Now let's get into the details of the income statement. At the top of any income statement, the first and important line is the company's sales. Companies will usually break down their sales into different segments or by geographies. This is because companies want to provide more detail around what makes up their sales. So if you look at Tesla, for example, you can see that they break down their revenue into automotive sales, which is revenue from selling vehicles, automotive leasing, which is essentially renting the vehicles to customers over a relatively long period of time. And then they have energy generation and storage. This is where the company has its solar panel business. Then financial services and others. If you look at Apple, on the other hand, they break out the revenue into two separate categories. Products, which is from the sale of physical products such as iPhones, iPads, AirPods, Apple Watches, and Macs. And then services, which is revenue from software and subscription services. So this would include App Store revenue, Apple Music, cloud storage, and anything else that isn't a physical product. It's really important to understand why companies separate their revenue into these different categories. When companies break...
And I will say this, like one reason Apple is so profitable is, I might be mistaken, but they charge like 30% on every single app that someone uses on their phone.
Down their revenue like this, it helps you as an investor have a more detailed understanding of how the company is performing, in the case of business. By Apple breaking out the services revenue from the product revenue, you can easily see how management is progressing against that goal. By comparing the year-over-year growth of the services revenue to that of the products revenue, you can see that the services revenue is growing faster. Now moving down to Apple's combined revenue, you as an investor usually want to see that revenue growing. This is why it's helpful for you to see at what rate the company is growing its revenue and then compare that to its competitors in the same industry. In the case of Apple, we can see that they grew revenue 5.5% in 2020 and 33.3% in 2021. Moving down the income statement, next we have cost of sales. These are the costs associated with building the product or service you are selling. So let's say you're General Motors and you sell cars. Your cost of sales would be the cost of the tires, the engine, the frame of the vehicle, the interior, speaking, the better. This is because having a high gross margin is representative of having strong pricing to produce an iPhone. If they are able to sell that phone for $750, their gross profit on that is $250. Calculated by taking the $750 sale price and subtracting out the cost of goods for that iPhone, $500. This is a gross margin of 33%, calculated by taking the $250 gross profit and dividing it by the $750 sales price. However, if Apple is able to sell that same iPhone for $1,000 instead, the gross profit increases to $500, calculated by taking the $1,000 sale price and subtracting out the $500 cost of sales. Then take that gross profit of $500 and divide it by the $1,000 sale price, leaving you with a 50% gross margin.
Now, I will say this, that anytime you got an industry that has profit margins of 50%, what happens? Now we can go back to Ford and the USA, back when Henry Ford had the I forgot what the name of the car was, or truck, but basically what they were doing is they basically gave anyone in America, it was a Model 1, and forgive me if I mistake the facts, but from what I remember or what I think happened was, let's say the car was worth $1,000. People would put $100 down and get the $1,000 car, and then they would have to pay interest, until the car is paid off. But anytime you have industry that has high profit margins, such as Ford did back in the days, what happened? You had China, you had Japan, you had Germany, you had England, you had all these countries come over here, and they basically stay until that profit margin shrinks, and there's just barely any profit left, until it's like 10 or 15% maybe. And that is why I don't really like Apple. I mean, I might be totally wrong. I mean, they do got a lot of cash. But basically what they've been doing over the years is anytime there's a competitor that's coming up, a little small company, 30 million, 40 million, 50 million, 100 million, that can compete with Apple, they buy them out before these little small companies become big companies. So basically, they have created a monopoly, basically, and we had a monopoly in the phone industry years ago, and they broke them up into 5 or 7 different companies. Verizon is one of them today. AT&T, I forgot the other ones, but they broke them up into 5 or 7 different companies because they were a monopoly. But somehow, in this world we live in today, we have allowed these companies to be monopolies, and there's nothing done. And I guess, now we're a worldwide economy, so you might be able to say, oh, well, they do got a competitor in China or something. And we do have a lot of, they're not monopolies, they're duopolies or whatever, where there's 2 dominant ones, like there's UPS, and then there's, I forgot the other one, but there's like UPS, and then there's like Boeing, and then you got Airbus. So there's a lot of and you could even argue Verizon and AT&T. But yeah, there's a lot of duopolies. It's going to take some strong congressional to probably take down Apple, or at least split them up or something, because to me they are a monopoly. And I don't know if it's going to be China, I don't know if it's going to be someone else, but eventually when you have an industry that has 50% profit margins, everybody's going to be coming at you. They're going to be coming at you from all sides. And Apple has been sued many times by these smaller companies.
This concept, something important to point out is the difference in gross margin between the product side of the business and the service side of the business. The gross margin in the services business is almost double that of the products business. Now you can see why management really wanted to focus on growing the services side of the business, and why it is important for Apple to break out the services revenue from the products revenue. As an investor, you generally want to see gross margins getting larger over time. This is the case with Apple. Gross margins were 37.8% in 2019, 38.2% in 2020, and 41.8% in 2021. Continuing down the income statement, next we have operating expenses. These are the expenses associated with running and selling, general, and administrative expenses, commonly referred to as SG&A. Research and development, as the name suggests, are costs associated with researching and developing new products. So in the case of Apple, an example of that would be the secret or not so secret Apple Car.
Now, something about research and development. One reason I don't particularly like pharmaceuticals is they have a very high R&D Um, so let's say I want to invent, Tylenol or something, and I might spend $100 billion, researching other products, and then I never find Tylenol, or never create it, or never goes to trial, or maybe there's various trials. There's like the first trial, and then maybe no one gets sick. Maybe there's a second trial, and then there's no one gets sick. But the third trial or whatever, then a couple people die or whatever, and they don't clear it to be safe. So what happens is, because there's such a high R&D expense in pharmaceuticals, they allow these companies that create these new drugs to charge an astronomical price for the first 10 years or 15 years or 20 years or whatever it is. Normally it's like 10 years, I would say. And hopefully they can recoup the expenses of all that R&D that they invested in. And then eventually you get to what's called generic. And then other companies, Walgreens or something, they might have a Tylenol, or go to the dollar store and get a Tylenol from there. But when Tylenol first came out, they were being charged a premium.
Company is working on. All of the expenses associated with that would be classified.
Oh, and then the other thing with pharmaceuticals is litigation. People love to sue, especially in this country. And you might be using baby powder for 10 to 15 years, nothing happened. Then all of a sudden, year 40, everybody's got cancer, and you trace it back to, well, they all use this Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. And we've seen numerous lawsuits, and then then you got to pay 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 billion dollars, and all these legal fees. So to me, that is a huge thing. And there's a lot of little small startup pharmaceutical biotech that companies that if they go to trials, the stock will shoot up, go from 2 to 8 overnight. But it's very risky, because you could still fail trial 3 or 4, or even if they're successful down the road, they could get sued.
That is R&D. SG&A are things such as office rent, employee wages, marketing, and pretty much any other costs associated with the business. The SG&A as a percentage of sales was 7% in 2019 and is 6% in 2021. Generally speaking, you want to see this trend downwards over time. Next, we have operating profit, which is essentially the company's profit before subtracting out taxes and interest paid on debt. This is calculated by taking your revenue and subtracting out the total cost of sales over time. In the case of Apple, we can see that the operating margin was 24% in 2019 and nearly 30% in 2021. The next line item is other income and expense.
Ben has done something that no one else.
Fall out of the scope of the company's normal operations. So if Apple made an investment in a tech startup and that investment made the company money, that would likely be included in this line. Then we have earnings before taxes, which is exactly what it sounds like. We then subtract out taxes to get a final net income figure. This is the figure that most people think of when they are talking about a company's profit. So now that we have an understanding of the basics of an income statement, it's important to also have an understanding of how different growth and profitability related variables will affect the company's future results.
Now, one thing I like is how they put all these things together here. When you normally look at an income statement is just going to have 2 years usually, and then it may only just have, if it's a quarterly report, just have the last 3 months. So you're kind of just getting like, it's almost like a movie reel where you're just you're getting a snapshot of this moment in time throughout the movie. So you're not getting the whole picture, you're just getting a snapshot, a little, at this particular date and this particular time in history, this is what their numbers were. And who knows, maybe the next day they have, made $30 million or $30 billion or something, and that really would have jumped, the picture of that moment in time, but it didn't fall on that particular day, so it didn't make it to the finances. But when you're analyzing a company long term, it's nice to look at, a 7, a 10 year. If you're looking for long term investments, look at the, and you can look at Apple and just see. You can see why Warren Buffett liked this thing. It was just steadily increasing on almost every little line. But most industries and most companies are not going to be cookie cutter and picture perfect like this. Where you got 37%, 38, 41, 42, 44, 45. You might have 37% one year, then next year's negative 20%, and then so you can see why people like Apple, and when you're looking at this thing, it's just a steady increase. It's just like a cash flow machine. But to me, with our country anyway, saying, oh, you got to pay your fair share, and we got to break up these big companies, and these big companies got to pay their fair share of taxes. Yeah, you might skate along for a ride for a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's going to be time to pay the piper at some point. And like I said, anytime you have an industry that you have 45% profit margins, they're going to be coming at you from every side, every angle, because everybody wants a piece of this pie here. That's $235 billion of profit. And these companies from all over the world are coming at you until this profit margin shrinks to 15-20%, and then they'll stop coming. Or maybe 10 or 15% they'll stop coming, but they're coming. They're coming for this. And I know what happened to BlackBerry. BlackBerry went to zero. There's a lot of phone companies, tech companies, that have gone to zero. And with technology changing as fast as it is, I don't know what the future holds, but I have a feeling there's going to be some new technology that basically makes Apple obsolete. Now, I could be 100% wrong. Or they get cocky and let's say they order, 5 billion iPhones or something, one for every human on the earth. and they only sell 1 billion of them. You know, they got to take a huge loss. But I watched a video a couple years ago in China, and you know, in China the average income is $10,000 a year per person. Well, just like the U.S. is $60,000 or so per person on average. Because you got some very wealthy people and you got a lot of poor people. And the same thing is true in China. You got a lot of poor people and there's some wealthy ones too. But the average in China is 10,000. They got a lot of people there. Now in China, if you made 10,000 a year, can you afford $1,000 iPhone? No, you can't. So what they are doing is they got a Samsung phone or a bootleg phone, and they'll the Apple companies are in China. They make them in China, and what they do is they steal the little Apple symbol from the Apple store or the Apple manufacturer where they make them. Someone steals them, sticks them in their pocket when they go home for lunch, and they slap these little Apple symbols on the back of a Samsung phone, and they sell it for $100. And that's what they use in China. They can't afford $1,000 iPhone, but they can afford $100 phone, and they slap an Apple Signia on the back of it. So that is one reason why I think Apple got very greedy. I don't like their practices of attacking any kind of small startup that tries to compete with them, and they either try to sue them to death and keep them in court, and knowing that they can't pay the legal fees, or they just buy them out.
I created a basic financial model that lets me see how different growth rates, gross margins, and operating expenses will ultimately affect Apple's profitability. All of the numbers in blue are variables that I can change based upon my future expectations for how the company will perform. These projections set the foundation for a discounted cash flow valuation, which is ultimately used to determine if a stock is undervalued. If it would be helpful for you guys, I can cover that in detail in a separate video. Just please let me know in the comments.
It's fine and dandy to slap a multiple, slap of this, slap of that on there, but when you're projecting years into the future, 1 or 2% differences can make drastic returns. Let's say instead of slapping 6% up there, she thought it was 10, or she thought it was 15, or she thought it was going to be 20. I do like how she takes a conservative view, whereas these numbers are actually less than these numbers, but you can analyze all you want into the future, but you really have no idea. A tornado or an earthquake or a volcano or a civil war or World War III could blow up the factory, could wipe out the factory. A cyber attack or something could wipe out their whole infrastructure. You have no idea what's going to happen years into the future. So to me, it's nice it's nice you can project into the future, but if you're buying this thing, you're looking at what the price of it is today. Is it undervalued today?
Just to show you how this works, let me walk through some hypothetical numbers. Let's say I assume that Apple will be able to grow the products business by 10%. And let's just say Apple is able to.
What happens when you assume? You make an ass out of you and me. All right, let's go over to the last one, which is the cash flow statement.
One thing I would love to say to all the staff at ACI is thank you.
Cash flow is king. In this video, we are going to go.
It's funny, they have a little picture of Ray Dalio, and this is the typical hedge fund manager. This is the typical thing that I despise. Him and his rainy day fund, where he likes to talk a lot. He likes to do a lot of analysis and thinks he's the smartest person in the room. And it was so funny, he said, cash is trash. Cash is trash. Let me see if I can find, cash is trash. I want to hear the video real quick. Because this was probably the stupidest thing this guy could ever say. But he runs the biggest hedge fund in the world. Well, why anyone would give money to this guy is they got to be an idiot.
Texted into the show on Friday and suggested right now that you have to be in the market full on. And so the question is whether everybody jumps on the train, everybody gets in full on, and then the problem arises.
I think that's most likely.
But then the question is, when do you jump off the train?
But also the question is, what do you jump into when you jump off the train? And the issue is, you can't jump into cash. Cash is trash, okay?
That has to be the dumbest thing you ever said in your life.
Cash is that they're going to, because they're going to print money. What do? You get out. Okay, so cash is not going to.
So what do you do?
So what you have to do is,
you got to go to your rainy day fund. I got my rainy day portfolio.
you have to have a well-diversified portfolio. And first of all, you have to be global, and you have to have balance. And I think, I don't want to read, well, the headline's going to be, anyway, I think that you have to have a certain amount of gold in your portfolio, or you have to have something that's hard. There are three monetary systems that happen. The first is, in the old days, it had intrinsic value. You'd carry around gold coins. Then we come up with the idea of banks or even central banks. And what they do is they create certificates, we call notes, that are claims on those things. And we print many more certificates than there is money in the bank. And then that's a linked system. And we did that, and we broke that in 1971. Then you have a fiat monetary system, which means that you can print whatever amount of money you want. And you can put that, and that's what governments do. So we're in that part of the cycle, bigger picture, so that when you think about things, the depreciation of the exchange rate and the printing of money, I think over the next few years is going to be the biggest thing.
If you want to buy gold, you buy Bitcoin?
No, there are two purposes of money: a medium of exchange and a storehold of wealth. And Bitcoin is not effective in either of those cases now.
Store of wealth?
No, because first
potentially,
it's too volatile. Because of the volatility, you can't go next to it. Someday when I would say Libra or something which has more stable value, has got more potential. But also, who's going to do the buying? Central bankers and others. What are they going to hold as reserves? What has been tried and true? Are they going to hold digital Bitcoin? They're going to hold gold. That is a reserve currency, and it's been a reserve currency for 1,000 years. I know this is going to be the headline of gold. I want to emphasize a bit of gold is a diversifier, and that's the advice I can give. I know I'm going to come out of here like Ray Dalio's wild on gold, And that's
Cash is trash. That was hilarious.
There's an old saying, cash is king. However, when it comes to investing, cash flow is king. In this video, we are going to go over how to analyze a company's cash flow statement. Investor just getting started off, or if you've been investing for a year, company, think of the cash flow statement as showing all of the cash that comes into the business and all of the cash that goes out of the business. A positive number represents cash coming into the business, while a negative number represents cash going out of the business. A cash flow statement allows you as an investor to understand how a company's operations are running, where its money is coming from, and how its money is being spent. The reason the cash flow statement is so important is that it tells you as an investor how much cash a business is generating. At the end of the day, how much cash a company is able to generate investing activities and financing activities, goods and services used in production, salary and wage payments to employees, rent payments, and any other type of operating expense. Next up, we have the investing activity section of the cash flow statement. This section includes any sources and uses of cash from a company's investments. So that would include purchases of property, plant, and equipment, investments the business made in other companies, and money spent on acquiring entire companies. The investing activity section is almost always a negative number, especially for companies that are growing, as they are using that cash to grow the business through investing in things like new locations, new equipment to make more products, or even buying other companies. And then the third section is referred to as financing activities. Cash from financing activities includes the sources of cash from investors or banks, as well as the uses of cash paid to shareholders. Payments of dividends, payments for stock repurchases, and repayment of debt are included in this category. Changes in cash from financing are cash in when capital is raised and cash out when dividends are paid. So, if a company issues a bond to the public, the company receives cash financing, and that is reflected by a positive number on the cash flow statement. However, when the company pays back the money that it borrowed, it is a cash outflow and shows up as a negative number. So now that we understand how the cash flow statement is laid out, let's go line by line of a real company's cash flow statement and talk about the important things you as an investor need to
I wonder what company this is. I wonder if we're still talking about Apple or talking about someone else.
watch out for. To do this, we are going to use Coca-Cola, one of the world's most iconic brands and companies, as an example.
Oh, Coca-Cola now.
If you ever wanted to research more about a company like Coca-Cola but didn't even know where to begin, check out one of my favorite investing apps, Quarter. I reached out to Quarter to sponsor this video because it has become an important tool in my investment research. Net income is usually the metric they are referring to. Net income is actually calculated on a different financial statement called the income statement. I made a video on how to analyze an income statement like a hedge fund analyst that you can check out here to learn how that figure is calculated. That video has gotten a ton of great feedback and has over 50,000 views so far. So check it out after this video to learn more about how to analyze financial statements. Anyways, back to Coca-Cola's cash flow statement. After starting with net income at the top of the cash flow statement, the end goal of the operating activity section is to be able to calculate net cash provided by operating activities, commonly referred to as operating cash flow for short. In between net income and that operating cash flow line, there are a few important items I want to draw your attention towards. The first is the line item called depreciation and amortization. Usually for most companies, this is one of the largest numbers in this section of the cash flow statement. Keeping it at a super high level, depreciation means that you write off the value of an asset over its expected useful life. The value of almost any asset depreciates over time, and you could write off a certain amount as an expense against taxes every year. So for example, let's say Coca-Cola buys a piece of equipment that costs $1,000 that the company believes they will be able to use for 5 years. So its quote, useful life is 5 years. This means that the specific piece of equipment depreciates by $200 every year, which is simply the $1,000 price of the equipment divided by the 5-year useful life. However, Coca-Cola paid for the $1,000 piece of equipment in cash up front, so the $200 annual depreciation expense is considered a non-cash expense because no additional cash is leaving the business each year. As a result, the depreciation and amortization expense for the year needs to be added back to the net income when we are calculating cash from operations. I know that may not make a ton of sense, but trust me, I could do an hour-long video on the topic of depreciation just by itself, so this quick, high-level overview of it is all you really need to know as an investor. The next line item that is important to pay attention to is stock-based compensation. This is simply when a company pays its employees in stock instead of purely just cash. So for example, let's say you work at Facebook. Each year, you may get $150,000 in cash and another $50,000 in stock of the company. This is a way companies try to encourage employees to stay employed with the company for longer and is very common in the tech industry. Coca-Cola isn't a technology company, so this number for them is relatively low, but this is a very important item to consider if you are analyzing a tech company. Just for some perspective, Facebook had a stock-based compensation expense of $6.5 billion in 2020. Just like depreciation, stock-based compensation expense is considered a non-cash expense because no actual cash is leaving the business, so it also gets added back to net income in order to calculate cash flow from operations. Jumping down the cash flow statement a bit, another important line item is the net change in operating assets and liabilities. This is also referred to as a company's working capital. Think of this as the cash needed to run the short-term operations of the business. Things such as paying suppliers and cash that a business is owed from its customers but not yet paid. Typically for companies that are growing, this is a negative number on the cash flow statement as more cash is needed to manage the day-to-day operations of the business as it's growing. However, for more mature companies like Coca-Cola, this number can vary between being a cash inflow, a positive number, and a cash outflow, a negative number, depending on the year. As we see with Coca-Cola, this line was actually a source of cash in 2020 and 2019, but a use of cash in 2018. All of these line items build up to the all-important net cash provided by operating activities or cash flow from operations. This number represents the amount of money a company brings in from its ongoing regular business activities and is an important benchmark to determine the financial success of a company's core business activities. Additionally, cash flow from operations is used to calculate what is referred to as a company's free cash flow. In my opinion, and from my experience as an investment analyst, free cash flow is the single most important metric in evaluating a business. This is because the value of any investment, whether it is a stock, apartment building, or a small business, is determined by the amount of cash flow the business will be able to generate over its life. In order to calculate free cash flow, we start with the cash flow from operations number. Then we subtract out what is referred to as capital expenditures, or CapEx for short. Capital expenditures is cash used by a company to acquire, upgrade, and maintain physical assets such as property, plants, buildings, technology, or equipment. CapEx is often used to undertake new projects or help the company grow or even just maintain its operations. Making capital expenditures on fixed assets can include repairing a roof, purchasing a piece of equipment, or building a new factory. So if Coca-Cola were to increase the size of one of its factories in order to keep up with the increased demand from consumers, the cash spent on increasing the size of the factory would be considered a capital expenditure. We find this number for CapEx in the investing section of the cash flow statement in the line titled Purchases of Property, Plant, and Equipment. However, there is one additional step we need to take in order to calculate what I refer to as net CapEx. We need to take the number for purchases of property, plant, and equipment, or PP&E for short, which was negative $1,177 in 2020. We then need to take the number for proceeds for disposal of property, plant, and equipment and add it to the negative $1,177 number. This is because we want to get to the true amount Coca-Cola spent on CapEx in any given year. So for 2020, we take the negative $1,177 for purchases of property, plant, and equipment and add back $189 for disposal of PP&E to arrive at a net CapEx number of negative $988. Now to calculate free cash flow, we take our cash from operations of $9,844 for 2020 and subtract out net CapEx of $988. This leaves us with $8,856. Remember that these numbers are millions. This means that Coca-Cola generated $8.8 billion in free cash flow in 2020. Remember how at the beginning of the video I said cash flow is king? Free cash flow is my favorite number to look at when analyzing a company because this is the amount of money that can be paid out to you as a shareholder. With this money, a company can pay out dividends, buy back stock, or even pay down debt, all things that are great for you as a shareholder. So now that we have free cash flow, I just want to share a couple of cool things that will be helpful in your analysis. When I'm evaluating stocks, one of the metrics that I like to look at is called free cash flow yield. This is calculated by taking a company's free cash flow and dividing it by its market cap. This calculation leaves you with a percentage. So in the case of Coca-Cola, we can see that the free cash flow yield has hovered around 3 to 4% in the past. All else being equal, the higher the free cash flow yield percentage, the better. Something else that is also helpful to look at is CapEx as a percentage of sales. This is a measure of what is referred to as a company's capital intensity, or put another way, how much money the company has to spend on maintaining and growing its operations. This is calculated by dividing the net CapEx number we calculated earlier by the company's total revenue. In the case of Coca-Cola, we see that they are spending around 3% of sales each year on CapEx. This number varies by industry, as certain industries are more asset intense than others. For example, a railroad spends a lot more on CapEx every year than a software company. Moving down the cash flow statement into the investing activity section, the next items I want to hit on are purchases of investments and proceeds. Typically, when a company has a lot of cash, they will invest it in short-term, non-risky investments such as short-term government bonds. This helps the company generate some return on the money instead of just having it sitting in a bank account and not earning any interest at all. Next up, we have acquisitions of businesses and disposals of businesses. It is very common for companies to acquire businesses in order to grow the business by entering a new geography or product line. This can take the form of Coca-Cola buying 100% of a company or making a sizable investment in a company where they own a significant stake. 10, 20, 30%, let's say, but not 100%. For example, in 2019, we can see that Coca-Cola spent $5.5 billion on acquiring businesses. After doing some research, I learned that included the acquisition of a brand called Costa and an ownership interest in CHI, a Nigerian producer of value-added dairy and juice beverages and iced tea. These are the things you want to know when researching a company. It's always important for you as an investor to see if a company is spending a lot of money on acquisitions. Just like companies frequently buy other companies, they also occasionally sell off companies and brands they own because those companies and brands may not fit in with the long-term strategy of the company anymore. I personally am a long-term focused investor and love to see when a company is able to continue to invest in growing the business while still being able to repurchase shares. I want to quickly share 2 examples of why share repurchases are so powerful. One that is high level and the one that is specific to Coca-Cola. In this example, let's say we have a company that, for simplicity purposes, has $100 in earnings and 100 shares outstanding. This means that the
You want companies to buy back their own stock if they are buying it back at a reasonable price. I mean, if you think the value of the stock you own is worth $50 and the current price is $10, and the company is buying back their shares at $10, that's great. That increases your ownership in the company without you investing another penny. But if you think the value of the company is worth $50 and the current stock price is $75, you do not want to see them purchasing stock at $75. Even though it increases your ownership in the company, they're buying it at a bad price. So, when a company has excess earnings, they can either reinvest that money into the business, acquire, build out the business, maybe buy another property. They could use that money to invest in other companies. They could pay dividends. They could also do share buybacks. On Capitol Hill, the last couple of years, there's been the Democrats had criticized companies for doing share buybacks, and so there is some political pressure against it. Some do both. Some pay dividends and do share buybacks. And one reason Buffett loved Bank of America so much is, well, the normal people get like a 3% dividend. He was getting like a 10% dividend because he helped bail them out during the banking crisis. So he got preferred shares at 10% instead of, the 3%. And not only that, but every year, Bank of America would buy back like 10% of their stock. So his ownership in the company just increased 10% year over year without him ever investing another penny. Without him investing another penny. So, if there's a pizza pie and, you got one slice of the pie, there's 10 slices, you got one slice, you got 10% of the company, and then, the company buys back 10% of all its shares, your ownership just goes up.
earnings per share is $1. Now let's say the company repurchases.
Now, the opposite can happen too, where companies dilute their shares, which means instead of buying back their shares, and instead of creating less shares out there, they issue more shares. And a lot of times they will do this. They'll give, hey, I'm going to give the executives, an extra 100,000 shares. Instead of, paying cash, we're just going to issue another 1,000,000 shares, and we're going to give, 100,000 to all the top dogs. This is dilution. So instead of your ownership increasing in the company, your ownership in the company is decreasing. So this is a bad thing. Maybe you bought a share of a company when they had 1,000,000 shares outstanding, and they decided to double it and make 2,000,000 shares, and your ownership in the company just decreased by half.
10 of those shares, bringing the shares outstanding down to 90. Watch how that impacts the earnings per share number. We now divide that $100 of earnings by the 90 shares outstanding. This means that earnings per share is now $1.11. This means the company was able to grow its earnings per share by 11% from $1 to $1.11 without growing the actual earnings the company is able to generate. This is why share repurchases can be so beneficial to us as investors. Another example of the power of share repurchases involves Coca-Cola and its most famous investor, Warren Buffett. Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway, is the largest shareholder of Coca-Cola, owning 9.3% of the entire company. However, when Buffett made his investment in Coca-Cola, he only bought 6.2% of the company. Since that purchase, his stake has grown by 50% without him purchasing even one additional share. This is because Coca-Cola has repurchased shares. This is probably the greatest example I have ever seen of the power of share repurchases for long-term investors. However, with that being said, to truly determine how much the company is spending on repurchasing shares, we also need to account for the line titled Issuances of Stock. Share issuances are the exact opposite of share repurchases. Instead of decreasing the number of shares outstanding, share issuances increase the number of shares outstanding. In order to see how much a company is spending on repurchasing shares, we need to subtract the amount of cash received from issuing new shares from the amount of cash the company spent on repurchasing shares. Once we do that, we actually see that Coca-Cola didn't truly spend any cash buying back shares in 2020 because cash from issuing shares far exceeded cash from repurchasing shares. This explains why the number of shares outstanding actually increased for Coca-Cola during 2020 compared to the previous year. Next up, we have dividends. As we can see, Coca-Cola is a huge payer of dividends to its shareholders. The company paid out over $7 billion in dividends in 2020 alone. A lot of investors want to see the amount a company is paying out in dividends increase every year. We can see that this is the case with Coca-Cola, as dividends paid out were $6.6 billion in 2018, $6.8 billion in 2019, and over $7 billion in 2020. If a company starts reducing its dividend payments or even just keeps them the same year over year, sometimes investors take this as a warning that the company is struggling. One analysis I like to do that is helpful is to add up the total amount spent on share repurchases and dividends. Then take that number and divide it by the free cash flow the company generated in that year. This leaves me with a percentage. Remember how early in the video I said free cash flow is my favorite metric because it shows how much a company spends on share repurchases and dividends? Well, this calculation shows me how much free cash flow a company is paying out to its shareholders via share repurchases and dividends. A percentage over 100% is considered unsustainable over a long period of time. This is because if a company is paying out more to shareholders than what it is generating in free cash flow, the company will either have to be issuing debt or depleting its cash. However, seeing it in 1 year like in 2018 for Coca-Cola isn't too worrisome. So there you have it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a big like and subscribe to the Investor Center, because my goal is to make you a better investor by studying the world.
Alright guys, there you got it. Balance sheet, income statement, and the cash flow statement.